Welcome to the year-end planning. Myself, Zach DeSetti, Brooke Deaver, and Drew Heffernan are here today, and we're going to cover a couple different areas of some items that you should consider, here at year-end. So I'm going to start us off by talking about some of the tax strategies that we're utilizing with clients. Also going to talk about the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that was enacted here this year. There are some tax law changes that were put in place, things we should consider for 2025 and for 2026. Brooke is going to talk about optimizing your retirement and investment plan, some numbers to be aware of, some things like RMDs and when to take those, and some strategies to kind of to combat all those things. And then Drew's going to wrap us up with some planning for the next generation, some ideas on what to do with younger adults or children that have some earned income, and some of the new provisions like Trump accounts that were passed through this One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So that's a quick look at our agenda today. I like to start us off with this slide here. In the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the TCJA was put into place to where the current income taxes were going to be extended. That was one of the things that we were looking at that might have changed if we didn't get this One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So I think it's good just to lay out the 10 to 37% tax range with the current 2025 income ranges there. You can maybe see where you fall. And we've put off to the side just a couple ideas that you should consider, depending on what tax bracket you're in. If you're in this 10 or 12% tax bracket, you can see on the bottom left-hand side, we want to accelerate a lot of income into those tax brackets. Things like Roth conversions, taking money out of IRAs, and utilizing a 0% capital gains rate. Those are all ideas on what to do if you're in kind of that tax rate there. And as we climb up the chart here into the 22, 24% tax bracket, we want to start taking into consideration, again, more deductions. We want to start doing some Roth conversions. We want to be careful of some of the income phase outs because a lot of those happen between that 12 and 24% tax bracket. We want to start doing some tax loss harvesting because you're not in a 0% capital gain rate anymore. You're likely in a 15%. So again, just some ideas if you're kind of in that middle tranche, and we're going to kind of go in depth with some of these things today. And lastly, if you're in that 32% or above, this is where we want to avoid pushing any income if we can do it. So take advantage of all the deductions we can. If we're charitably inclined, utilize some strategies to lower income, take money out of Roths, which are tax-free, and again, continue to do some tax loss harvesting to avoid that next level, which is a 20% rate there. So just some ideas for today. I mentioned the One Big Beautiful Bill Act a couple times. From a tax standpoint here in 2025, like I mentioned, that TCJA income tax brackets were extended. So that gave us some clarity to give you the advice that you needed. Luckily, that came up earlier in the year versus later in the year. So it gave us some runway. For those of you who are itemizing, this state and local tax deduction, the cap moved from 10 to 40,000. So again, if you're itemizing that depending on what state you're in, that allow you to capture some of those state and local taxes. And then finally, for 2025, from a tax standpoint, the senior deduction. We've heard of this as the Social Security deduction and some other terms, but really what this is that if you're age 65 or older, if you're an individual filer, you get an additional $6,000 of deduction on top of your standard filer. If you're married filing jointly, you get an additional $12,000, and there are some income phase outs, so be careful about that bracket of $175,000 or $250,000 for married filing jointly. If you're making more than that in income, then you would not qualify for those additional senior deductions. But if you are, just know that normal $31,000 is going to go up pretty dramatically, and so you might be able to plan for that a little bit there. I'm going to talk about two things that we're doing a lot here towards the year end. Charitable giving, which there are some updates in 2026, so we'll talk about that here in a slide or two. And then as a quick reminder, the estate tax exemption is one thing that we were concerned about potentially reverting back to if we had our current tax law expire, but it is going to be continued and actually going to go up to $15 million per person next year in 2026. So pretty good news there. Again, I mentioned two things that with my clients I'm talking a lot about here at year end, and again, Roth conversions and charitable giving. So here on the screen, you see a couple ideas around Roth conversions on really when we want to do that. We're doing Roth conversions because you have a large pre-tax balance, and this often creates an RMD, required minimum distribution, that Brooke's going to talk about here in just a couple minutes. But if you have a large pre-tax balance, it might be creating an RMD that's actually higher than the income that you need to take. And so how do we start to reduce that RMD if possible? Well, we do that via a Roth conversion. We take that pre-tax balance and we elect to pay some taxes earlier than we may need to. So likely you're going to wait and do that until retirement when your income goes down, which gives you more room within the tax brackets to do that conversion. But we also see people doing a lot smaller conversions while they're working. If they're in the 22 or 24% bracket and they have some room before they go into that next bracket above, there might be some reason to do some Roth conversions there. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but a couple ideas to implement before year end if you're considering, if you have a large pre-tax balance, and we're looking at those RMDs. And again, lastly, charitable giving. A couple numbers here that have kind of updated for this year and some new things coming forward. The annual gift limit is $19,000 per year. That's not changing for next year. So again, this is what you can give to another individual. That's per person. So you get to multiply that times 2 if you're married filing jointly, and you can give that away each year without taking against your lifetime limit. But a couple other ways to give through charity is a qualified charitable distribution, what we refer to as a QCD. And this is a direct gift from your IRA or your 401k if you're 70 and a half or older. So if you're making any kind of charitable giving and you're 70 and a half or older, make sure you're doing this in the form of a QCD. Again, get with your advisor and let them know that, so that way we can properly, help you with that. But this is one of the things that we would look to first if you're 70 and a half or older, is to make that distribution from an IRA or a 401k. If you're not 70 and a half and you're doing charitable giving, we often are using donor advised fund, which is a earmarked account for charity. The year in which you gift to a donor advised fund, you get to take a deduction for that gift. Now, there are limits. If you give cash, you get to deduct 60% of your AGI. If you're giving securities, you only get to deduct 30%, up to your AGI. But again, we'll help you with all those details, but it's a way to kind of accelerate some of those deductions. If you remember one of my first slides, if you're in that 32 or 37% tax bracket, we want to increase our deductions in those brackets if we can. So making a donor advised fund gift is a way to bring some taxable income down if we are charitably inclined. Now, these two last bullet points are actually new things starting in 2026 that we'll be able to take advantage of. So if you've been just taking the standard deduction, but you've been giving some cash gifts each year, you're now going to get a little bit of credit for that. So again, you get to still take the standard deduction. And if you're single, you get a $1,000 additional deduction on top of the $31,000. Or if you're married filing jointly, you get an additional $2,000 for those cash gifts. So a little bit of credit for those contributions that you haven't really been able to take advantage of in the past. And then lastly, on gifts to donor advised funds, there's going to be a new floor for those gifts. And what I mean is that you're not going to get credit for the first 0.5% of your AGI. So a quick example is if you had $100,000 in AGI and you wanted to give $10,000 away to a donor advised fund, well, 0.5% of 100,000 is $500. And again, you want to give a $10,000 gift, you're only going to be able to deduct $9,500 because that first 0.5% is not going to count, towards that deduction. So those, again, last two things are things that we're going to plan for in 2026. What that means is that if you are planning on doing a deduction or doing a donor advised fund, you might look at doing that this year before you lose out on potentially 0.5% of your AGI, when that rule goes into effect next year. So just make sure you're talking with your advisor, keeping them in the loop about any, gifts that you plan on doing or contributions. If you want to consider doing a Roth conversion, we have all the technology in our cash flow planning softwares to run some of those models for you. Brooke, I'm going to turn it over to you and talk about some retirement investment plan options.
Thank you, Zach. So Zach already mentioned a little bit about required minimum distributions. We thought it made sense to go a level deeper here. So let's cover 4 different situations that we commonly encounter when clients are RMD age. And before we go into those, let's talk about the ever-changing RMD rules. So it seems like every major tax legislation that is passed includes a new wrinkle and new changes to RMDs. It's a lot for us to keep up with, and so we try to be diligent and keep clients as informed as possible. Why do those RMD rules always change? Well, there's a whole lot of money that either can come into the government coffers or not come into the government coffers, depending on how those RMD rules are set. And so we see Uncle Sam here lurking in the background to the side. Uncle Sam and Aunt Sam want their money, and one way to get it faster or slower is monkeying around with the RMD rules. So that's why they seem to change with great regularity in a lot of the tax legislation that we've had the last decade or so. So let's look at these 4 situations. If you're already taking your RMD, then just continue your withdrawals as usual. Just make sure that you fully withdraw your RMD for 2025 by the end of the year. If you turn 73 in 2025, right now for people turning age 73 this year, this is the year that you take your first RMD. So most people will withdraw their first RMD by the end of 2025. There is a special rule for that first year that you can delay it until April of 2026. However, be aware that most people don't delay taking that first RMD, because then you'll have 2 RMDs in your first or in your second year of RMDs. So again, that's a nuance, and depending on your income before in your first year, in your second year, you can talk with your advisor and determine when it's best to take that RMD. But there is that special rule for the first one when you turn age 73 in 2025. So moving forward, if you're going to turn age 73 in 2026, or if you're 73 or over in 2026, then just remember that your year-end balance, the balance coming up in December of this year, is a major component of the calculation of your RMD. It's that year-end balance times a life expectancy factor, and that determines your RMD for the next year. It's a good idea to kind of think through in the last couple months of this year how large your RMD might be next year, particularly since the stock market has had another strong year of performance and bonds have performed well as also. Account balances have grown for a lot of people. And so it's a good time to think through how large your RMD is projected to be in 2026 and see if you want to accelerate a withdrawal to make that smaller in 2026 by taking a withdrawal in the last month and a half here. And then do remember, as Zach was talking about, you don't have to wait until age 73 to utilize those qualified charitable distributions. As soon as you reach the day of being 70 and a half, then you can start using the qualified charitable distributions and make those donations directly to church or charity. Another reason that's really important for many people is we have the IRMA schedule, which is a schedule that impacts our Medicare premiums. And if you use qualified charitable distributions, your charitable giving doesn't get lost inside your standard deduction, and it doesn't hit your income, which can push you up toward paying higher Medicare premiums. So always be thinking about QCDs as one way to do some or all of your charitable giving. Next slide. Perfect. Okay, so another wrinkle in RMDs is for inherited IRAs. Now, as it says there, we're going to focus on non-spouse beneficiaries. So if you inherit an IRA from your spouse, then what most people do is they just make their spouse that passed away, they make their IRA their own. So then it's pretty simple. If you're a non-spouse beneficiary, there are some rules to be aware of and some new rules for 2025. So again, we're going to walk through 4 different scenarios. The first scenario, the first 2 scenarios focus on whether or not the person that passed away, i.e. the original owner of that IRA, were they already taking their RMDs, or had they not started taking their RMDs? So if they hadn't started taking their RMDs yet, then you don't have any annual RMD that has to be taken from that IRA that you inherited. However, it does need to be fully withdrawn by the end of the 10th year following the death of the owner, the original owner of that IRA. So let's contrast that to the second scenario where the original owner passed away after they had already started taking their required minimum distributions. In that case, and this is new for 2025, then we have to take an RMD each year during that 10-year period, and then we have to clean out the IRA by the end of the 10th year. So a lot of tricky rules here, and the new one for 2025 is if you inherited an IRA and the original owner was already taking RMDs, then you do have to take an RMD by the end of 2025. So transitioning to better news, if you inherit a Roth IRA, those don't have any annual required minimum distribution requirements. So you can let the tax-free and tax-deferred growth continue inside of that inherited Roth IRA, but do remember that it has to be withdrawn by the end of the 10th year following the passing away of the person you inherited it from. And then for age 70 and a half beneficiaries, so if you have an inherited IRA and you are 70 and a half, you can also utilize the qualified charitable distributions that we've talked about from an inherited IRA. And again, that's important based on whether you're itemizing or not, and to make sure that you minimize the amount of income that's showing on your tax return. So the next topic we wanted to walk through is the super catch-up contributions. So these have to do with participants in 401k plans, 403b plans, and 457 plans. 401k are traditionally plans used for-profit entities. There's some exceptions to that. 403b plans are for not-for-profits and schools, for example, and 457 plans are most common in governmental organizations. But if you're a participant in one of those plans, you may be eligible to do a super catch-up contribution. And to be eligible to do a super catch-up contribution, you have to be in a small age range of age 60 to 63. So the standard catch-up for age 50 plus is $7,500. So anyone over age 50 who's participating in a plan through work, a 401k, a 403b, or a 457, they can certainly make a $7,500 additional contribution to that plan above their normal deferral amount, which is $23,500 this year. However, if you're at the special magic age range, you can do the super catch-up for ages 60 through 63, and as you can see, that's a few $1,000s more than the normal $7,500 catch-up. So looking ahead to 2026, a new rule that's going to be in place for 2026 and is how those catch-up contributions are handled. This piece of legislation was actually passed several years ago, but the IRS and the government, Congress in its provisions made sure that there was a couple years time for record keepers and payroll systems to basically reprogram their systems to be able to handle this provision. So this is one where Uncle Sam and Aunt Sam want to get tax revenue sooner from high income earners. So if in 2025 you had earned income that exceeded $145,000, your catch-up contribution or your super catch-up contribution must go into a Roth bucket. So that'll be an after-tax contribution. So you won't get the tax deduction for that additional catch-up or super catch-up, but it will go into a Roth bucket, grow tax deferred, and in most cases, it can come out tax-free. So these are a couple of ways that offer us a valuable opportunity to boost our savings when we're age 50 and over, or in that window of 60 to 63. I know there's probably some people on the webinar today that are younger than that. And so the encouragement from us, if you are, is think about whether or not you can increase your contribution in 2026 to your retirement plan by 1% or 2. Every little bit helps. And so again, if you aren't in these 50 plus age range right now, maybe consider increasing your contribution. A couple of final year-end planning strategies that we thought we wanted to emphasize. And again, Zach talked about this a little bit. In years where your income is lower, it can definitely make sense to do a Roth conversion. Picture in your mind those tax brackets that Zach walked through. And when you're in a lower tax bracket, it can be really beneficial to do a Roth conversion and pay a lower marginal tax rate on that. One of the holy grails of investing is deferring paying taxes when you're in a higher tax bracket and pay taxes when you're in a lower tax bracket. So again, if your income's lower, a Roth conversion can definitely make some sense. If your income is higher, one way to get deductions for higher income earners, particularly in a year when your income is high, is to think about funding a donor advised fund or making an additional contribution to your donor advised fund. I have a lot of clients where in the last year that they're working, they may have additional sick pay that's unused or paid time off that's paid, and they may have a higher income that last year or two during their working years, and then their income will be lower early in retirement. And so that's a great time to bunch together planned charitable giving, and an effective and efficient way to do that is through a donor advised fund. Another item to point out is we just recently received the update on what the Social Security raise is going to be for 2026. So everyone who is currently receiving Social Security benefits is going to get a 2.8% raise starting in January. And then the last thing, and we put some exclamation marks by this because it's often neglected, but so important, is estate planning. All of us that are presenting today, we work regularly with our clients, encouraging them to review their estate plan, get one in place if it's not, and make sure that it's current and updated. And an updated estate plan or a current estate plan allows us to make sure beneficiary designations and things like that are listed properly on your accounts. We want to make it easy for the folks that are going to work with your accounts when you're no longer with us, and having your estate plan up to date and making sure it's properly funded and making sure your beneficiary designations are current is a great thing to commit to in the last 50 days of the year. I think some of you know this, but here in-house at InfiniTALKS, we have Jim Stanziola and his team. Many of us here at the firm refer to Stanziola Law, and Jim and Meredith and their team do a great job with estate planning documents. They can review your existing documents, or they can help recreate a plan. My wife, Suzanne, and I, we totally redid our estate plan toward the end of 2023. And I remember the first couple of weeks after we got that updated, when I laid my head on my pillow at night, I just had a sigh of relief and was appreciative of getting that done and knowing that our affairs were much more buttoned up than they had been via updating our estate plan. So I think that's the end of my slides. So we'll pass it on to Drew to anchor us and get us to the finish line.
Yep. So we've talked about, a lot of older, the older generations and how that they can take advantage of the year-end planning. But now we're going to kind of focus on the next generation with the anchor here. So the first thing I want to talk about is establishing some Roth IRAs for young income earners. So one thing that gets overlooked is if you have a child that is making earned income and the income is reported on a tax return, they're actually eligible to contribute to a Roth IRA. So now this Roth IRA actually has to be opened as a custodial Roth IRA underneath your parent or guardian, but it does allow for the younger generation to kind of start saving at an early age and creating, decades of tax-free growth. Kids are typically in a pretty low tax bracket, so being able to pay those taxes at a lower rate now means that they're not going to have to down the road in the future. So just keep in mind that, where it pertains to year-end timing, because contributions for 2025 can be made up until April 15th of 2026 for those Roth IRAs. And so now we're going to move into the new phenomenon called Trump accounts. What exactly are they? So a Trump account is a tax-advantaged savings account for children that's going to be similar to an IRA, but it's going to be funded with a one-time $1,000 federal contribution. So these are very new. It just came out in the One Big Beautiful Bill. So there's really not a lot of guidance on exactly the logistics of these accounts and how they're going to be funded. So keep that in mind as we're kind of going through what exactly they are and how we can open them in the future. So like I had mentioned, it's an account for children. Now, the one-time contribution is going to be for the children born between January 1st of 2025 and December 31st of 2028. So eligible children born, excuse me. That's going to be for that one-time $1,000 contribution. Now, any kid that is still under the age of 18 can open one of these accounts. And we're going to move into how some of the funding kind of works, but they are just not going to be eligible for that one-time federal deposit. How these accounts are funded is through the $1,000 federal contribution. It's automatically deposited for those eligible kids that are born between that window from January 1st to December 31st, January 1st, 2025, December 31st of 2028. And then after that, we are able to actually contribute to that account, which are limited to $5,000 per year. It also can include contributions from parents, guardians, relatives, and even employers, but the employer contributions are going to be limited to $2,500 of that $5,000 limit. One of the big advantages of these Trump accounts is that the money is going to be able to grow on a tax-deferred basis. So another way to give that younger generation an opportunity to begin investing on a tax-deferred basis at a very young age. So then some of the key limitations to these Trump accounts and is going to be the access. So one thing that's kind of come out about these Trump accounts is that children are generally not going to be able to access these funds until they reach age 18. So once they actually reach age 18, the distributions kind of look like a traditional IRA. So the withdrawals are going to be taxed at their ordinary income rates. And there's also going to be a 10% penalty if you pull that money out before age 59 and a half, unless it is for specific expenses, one of those expenses being college tuition. And like I had mentioned earlier, this is there's very few details on the logistics and funding of these accounts. We're expecting for there to be more guidance coming in 2026. Another preemptive way to help plan for the next generation would be establishing powers of attorney for young adults. So a power of attorney is going to be a legal document that's just going to allow for someone to act on behalf of another person. So as soon as these kids turn 18, they become a legal adult, and parents no longer have automatic rights to make medical or financial decisions on their behalf. So some of these things would be paying bills or rent, or helping manage bank accounts, handling tuition, insurance for kids that are driving vehicles, signing financial documents. And then on the medical side, things such as authorizing treatment, accessing medical records, or communicating with healthcare providers. So again, at the age of 18, they become a legal adult, so parents are no longer able to speak on behalf of their child. So this is something that you can put in place for any emergency events, that you are still able to act on behalf of your child. So in any of those emergencies, it basically covers all bases in making sure that you are still able to help out your children that are now legally adults. And now we're going to move into some 529 plan things and what has changed going forward into 2026. So one of the big things is 529 plans now cover a larger group of qualified expenses for education related expenses. So this would be things like college admission exams, AP tests, educational therapies, curriculum, materials, tutoring, post-secondary credentialing fees. So this makes a 529 a lot more attractive for people that are trying to find tax advantage ways to help pay for their child's education in the future. So making those contributions towards the end of the year, and we'll get into that a little bit later, it's a really good idea to take care of some of these expenses that you might not think about that could be used tax advantaged money with. And then some of the other new rules is the K-12 withdrawal limits have actually doubled for 2026. So in the past, it was only $10,000, and now it has jumped up to $20,000. So this is another way that they're expanding those expenses to allow more flexibility in these 529 accounts. So it's one reason to maybe, consider pushing money into that 529. So if you're doing monthly contributions, that's great. And then just thinking of a year-end planning, it might be a good idea to pop in that lump sum before the end of the year. And then, as I just kind of mentioned, just making sure that we're maximizing those 529 contributions, because one thing that the 529 allows for is state tax deductions. So if you get those funds in before the end of the year, depending on which state you're in, there are different types of deduction limits for how far those funds will actually go in that 529 plan. So, like I had mentioned, if you're not contributing monthly, especially at year end, this is a great time to make that lump sum contribution. And if you look at your individual state, all the states are different on their deduction limits. Some of the local ones are, Kansas has a $3,000 individual deduction and $6,000 joint. That is per beneficiary. And Missouri has an $8,000 individual and $16,000 joint deduction limit on those 529 plans. So make sure to check in on your local state law to see exactly how much you can get on the deduction limit for those 529 accounts. But especially coming up on the year end, now is a great time to make sure that we are fully funding those to take care of all tax advantages that we can. So.
Thank you for joining today. We hope you found a couple nuggets of information very helpful as you look to close out hopefully what was a good 2025, and we look forward to seeing you all in your next planning meeting.